Landscapes of Injustice is a 7-year research project to research and tell the history of the dispossession of property of Japanese Canadians in the 1940s.
It's a 7-year, 5 universities, multi-partner institutions research project.
Our project is probably the last major project that has that opportunity to work directly with people who remember these events, who experienced them themselves.
Most of us had never had these types of discussions with other Japanese Canadians. It was difficult. People lost their homes, their vehicles, their farms, their fishing boats, their dishes, that they were dispossessed of opportunities. And then you couple that with the mental health aspect and the trauma that only now, I think, is beginning to be addressed. So the story of my father, the whole story of the Promises of Law was amazing, fascinating. He was one of the 3 men who were chosen by the Japanese Canadian community to go to Ottawa to literally say to the Prime Minister, "You broke a promise."
Vivian didn't know the history of her father's involvement in that legal case, and I think broadly our research has been able to convey things to the community, members of the community, institutions with the community that weren't already known. And so what we've done, to me, is that that form of research that's very curious, that asks questions to which none of the people asking knows the answer, and then pursues them together.
Because I think what the research has done is not only engage the community, it's engaged a lot of people who are interested, not just in the Japanese Canadian history, but in social justice and the legal history of Asian Canadians.
So the museum exhibit is structured as a straightforward chronology, but we've really endeavored to tell the story of the dispossession of Japanese Canadians through first-person narratives as much as possible.
In the beginning, we introduce 7 narrators, and it really sets the stage for telling a very complicated story through individual stories. It places the visitor right there with the people who lived it.
My connection to the Tagashira family is that I'm Masue and Rinkichi's grandson. I'd like to share something that is quite meaningful to me. It's an invoice pad from the war. And the date on it is 1904, and then there's a blank on the pad. And there were hundreds of these made, and of course he thought he was going to be using these, and he was quite successful, so he got a lot of them made to be used for his company. And unfortunately he wasn't able to use them because of all that happened, the hardship that took place. So I used these pads in the early 80s at university doing calculus on the back of the pads because there was space to do them. So every time I kind of used them, I thought about how hard he worked. And that got me to work even harder.
One thing that I'm really proud of in the museum exhibit is the diversity of stories. Japanese Canadians dealing with the legacy of loss and facing a difficult history, but also the descendants of the bureaucrats and neighbors of Japanese Canadians who have also lived with this story.
What I hope others would learn about the exhibit and Masue's story is that it's just one story out of thousands of stories, and not just about Japanese Canadians, but about other injustices that have taken place in the world.
So why teach about the Japanese Canadian dispossession? Well, I think I would flip it and say we're talking about Canadian history. These are issues of injustice. These are issues of how we treated Canadian citizens during a time of war. One of the aspects of the project was to create teachable resources for public schools for use Canada-wide. It works in essentially a chronological fashion, but has thematic elements. So there's 4 broad lessons. One is immigration and settlement. The second is the internment area. The third focuses specifically on dispossession. And then the fourth is on the legacies of dispossession.
I had the opportunity to work with Mike Perry Whittingham on the development of the teacher resources for the high school level. I could imagine myself as a high school student just being so interested in being able to get my hands on these primary sources. And Mike has designed exercises that challenge students to think about that policy-making process and in a way put themselves in those shoes.
By telling these stories, we present, I think, a more forthright and honest story about Canada's past. We can then bring that story forward and say these things still are occurring here. They are a legacy of this past. What are the steps we should be taking to take this further?
This is a publicly accessible database. It's a staggering amount of information that we are putting together in one cohesive place for access to the public. It's a lot of material to harmonize into one cohesive unit and make it easily searchable, which we've done with a static search capabilities.
Oftentimes it's very difficult to do family research, and these records will provide some insight for individuals who are doing research on their family history, and particularly on the forced dispossession and dispersal of the community during the Second World War and after.
I was able to look up my grandparents, my great-grandparents on both sides of my adopted family. You would think it would just be a dry read, but it's very emotional.
It was quite a personal journey to read the file. It was over 500 pages in the file, and I basically discovered that well, not only was my grandfather a really smart guy, I understood how he valued himself and how he valued what he had built in this country. So what I wish for other Japanese Canadian descendants of internees is to keep an open mind and an open heart. Reading the files on your family members can be a very moving experience, and it is a process of discovery of self.